Okay, so in chapter 10, we're going to talk about victims of rapes and other types of sexual assaults. So the word rape comes from the Latin rapere, which means to take by force. Okay, and we've got a variety of different definitions here. So at common law, the common law definition of rape is the unlawful carnal knowledge committed by a man against a woman who was not his wife. So this definition means men are not victims of rape, and that it also means that women cannot be raped by their husbands. Okay, so common law, if you don't recall from your criminal law classes, that is the law that's common to all parts. It's the law that is initiated. It's brought over here to the colonies from England, and then eventually our laws get codified. Today we tend to talk more about forcible rape. We're talking about lack of consent and use of force. Okay, so it is not gender specific anymore. Basically it's that the victim fears some harm if they do not comply. So the really key issue here is lack of consent. Aggravated rape generally means when there's more than one assailant, there's a weapon present, or there's some type of additional injury. And then we also have here what's called statutory rape. So this is when somebody, one of the partners is under the age of consent in that particular state. And that varies by state, although most states set it at 16. But most states also have exceptions called Romeo and Juliet clauses. And these basically allow for age differences. Only Massachusetts and California don't allow for age differences. So in Massachusetts, the age of consent is 16, and in California, it's 18. So that basically means in Massachusetts, if you have sex with someone who is under the age of 16, that's considered statutory rape. The law is not called statutory rape. The law is called rape of a child. So that's what will go on your record. If both people are under the age of 16, they are both offenders, and they are both victims as well. So again, as we talked about in the prior chapter, we start to have a lot more awareness around this in the 70s. We see the first rape crisis centers developed in the 70s, and we start to see a lot more awareness around this. This is where we see a lot more pro-victim, anti-rape movement, part of the women's movement. It's really exposing some ongoing injustice, abuse, and systematic neglect. So one thing to think about is that rape is a highly underreported crime, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And we're living right now in a moment where we're starting to see a lot of that. We have the Me Too movement. We have Dr. Nasa from USA Gymnastics. It was recently sentenced. And so women fail to report for many reasons. And all you really need to do is look at some of these current examples that are happening in the law and see why women fail to report. So you might be familiar with the case from Stanford University, Brock Turner, where he assaulted a woman who was unconscious behind a dumpster. And I believe it was caught on videotape. And the judge only gave him 6 months because he didn't want to, quote, ruin his future. So all we need to see are things like that to really understand why people don't report. There are many reasons. The criminal justice system is male-dominated. They're often concerned with what kind of relationship existed prior to the rape rather than the violence caused by the rape. And in reality, most rapes are not strangers. So we sort of have this idea that rape is a stranger jumps out of the bushes and he assaults you and he threatens you with a weapon. But most rapes actually happen between people who know each other. Rape is also not about sex. It's about power and control. So what are some of the outcomes of being sexually assaulted? Well, we often hear, basically post-traumatic stress disorder that is more specific to sexual assault. And so victims experience a wide range of emotions, and victims cope in very different ways. Just because a rape is not completed, it's attempted, doesn't mean it doesn't still have, same lasting impact. And there's also an increased risk of suicide amongst victims of sexual assault. Pregnancies can occur as a result of rape, and that can become a very high-profile issue due to issues, related to abortion. And also, there has been a movement where rapists have actually been allowed visitation or parental rights with the child in some states. So one thing that kind of comes about in the 80s is we get this term date rape, and it appears on the cover of Time magazine. And it's trying to capture what we now know of as acquaintance rape and what is actually what most rapes look like, that the person is not assaulted by a stranger. Okay. Now, when your book here talks about real rapes or ideal rapes, we're harkening back to the stuff we talked about in those first few chapters about how some victims appear to be ideal victims, right? Truly innocent victims. So real rapes, in quote, right, is an unsuspecting female and she's assaulted by a stranger. That stranger is armed. She fights back, struggles, and suffers injuries as a result. When she is assaulted, she's engaged in some wholesome activity. And when she escapes, she goes right to the police and reports it, and there's plenty of forensic evidence. Those cases are treated with dignity and sensitivity by the criminal justice system. But those cases are few and far between. Even when people go to get a rape kit done, a lot of times there isn't forensic evidence present. And even when there is evidence, evidence can only point to sexual conduct and sexual contact. There's nothing in the rape kit that proves that something is non-consensual. So one thing we talked about, as I mentioned, is acquaintance rapes. And this is the vast majority of sexual assaults. There's a prior relationship, and that causes us to question the seriousness of the act, especially if it has occurred between people who have had consensual sexual activity before. Some people might also look at what kind of behavior contributes to this, contributory behavior. So when we think about this, and by the way, I don't care for any of these words, what your book is referring to is that there may be a series of consensual acts, kissing, maybe touching, things that have been agreed upon, and then the person, penetrates without consent. So if we try to think about victim precipitation here, and I encourage you not to, are some rapes involving certain circumstances less serious due to the prior conduct of the victim? When it comes to sexual assault, which is my area of expertise, we don't want to blame the victim here. We want to be very careful about what we're talking about. So some people argue that if there was a series of consensual behavior beforehand, the rape is somehow less serious. But I want you to think about the fact that if someone sexually assaults you, forces you to engage in sexual activity against your will, without your consent, that's no less serious because you consented to kissing beforehand. Advocates will claim that what counts is that she was stripped of control, denied the right to make a decision, and compelled to submit to someone else's sexual desire. So legal definitions here hinge on coercion, and they don't hinge on the prior relationship of the accuser and the accused, although unfortunately the system does take that into account, even though legally it shouldn't. Juries take that into account. Prosecutors take that into account when deciding whether or not to move forward. So a lot of times we hear a lot of victim blaming, and I worked as a rape crisis advocate. So I was a medical advocate, which means I met women and men in the hospital within 120 hours of being assaulted. And I met with them and I talked with them about what their options were, what their legal rights were, refer them to different services. And so you see this even amongst significant others. So people who are there to support the victim in the hospital will often hear people talk about, well, you were drinking beforehand or you were using drugs. You put yourself in a bad situation. The way you were dressed was inappropriate or suggestive. I don't think we hear about hitchhiking as much anymore because I don't think people do this as much. Date rape is, quote, a terrible misunderstanding of what she said or meant. And that certain lifestyles may precipitate rape. We do know that there are places where this is much more likely to occur. So fraternities, kind of generally a hotbed of sexual assault there. We see that there are elements of fraternities, there are elements of sports teams that make these situations more likely to occur. And so while certainly you could be in a higher risk situation and certain behavior may put you at higher risk, that is no excuse for somebody to touch you without your permission. So when we think about victim blaming, what really happens? Well, we make men less culpable and less deserving of punishment if the woman shares responsibility. It also means, ladies, that it's your responsibility to make sure you don't get raped, right? You have to be better educated. You have to behave differently. You want to make sure you're not implying anything. Another thing I'd like you to think about, though, is how insulting some of this can actually be towards men. When we say things like, well, a woman was dressed a certain way, what did she expect? What we're saying about men is that they're not capable of kind of keeping it together, that they're not capable of ignoring their sexual instincts, that, oh my God, if a woman is wearing spaghetti straps or a short skirt, wow, you're incapable of controlling yourself. And I think that not only is this, when we judge people about how they're dressed, not only is it harmful to women, but it's also really insulting to men to say that you're not capable of controlling yourselves. A victim defending perspective says that nothing justifies this behavior. I don't care what how you're dressed, how you're dancing, and that use of force to compel should not be confused with sex. Okay? So sometimes you'll hear people talk about non-consensual sex. Sex is consensual. If it's not consensual, it's rape or sexual assault. When unwanted intercourse occurs, a real rape has been committed. It's not a seduction. If somebody says no to you, no means no. There's also a movement today that talks much more about affirmative consent, making sure, not only looking for someone didn't say no, but that someone is giving you the go-ahead for whatever behavior you're engaging in. We also want to remember that even though most of our rape prevention is all about how women can make themselves safer, we also need to teach the larger culture not to engage in sexual assault. We can see here some trends over a 40-year period here. We've got the NCVS rate and the UCR rate here. So keep in mind that, the UCR is going to be woefully underreported in terms of, that this is a crime that is often not reported to the police. So in 2013, about 45% of victims reported their rape to the authorities and about 55% did not. There's a great deal of research that tells us how the very first person you disclose a sexual assault to, how they react to you will pretty much dictate whether or not you tell other people. So it's always important to think and kind of keep your own stuff in check when someone is disclosing to you. In 2013, the number of reported rapes reached its lowest point since the late 70s. So, is that because that's decreasing or something else happening? So victims are often women in their late teens to early 20s. That's the highest risk group. They're often unmarried, low income. Those at highest risk are Black, unemployed, and reside in large cities. From 2006 to 2010, less than a quarter of rapes were committed by strangers. So again, when we look at that, right, we sort of have this idea that rape is a stranger. But as with most crime, we know that we are most in danger from people we actually know and trust, which is a little scary. So what about, rapes that are unfounded? Well, there's some research that tells us, there's some research out of LA, looking at LA County, that shows us that people are using unfounded or not even unfounded, exceptional clearances incorrectly. So when we unfound a crime, we're saying someone has reported a crime, but we don't believe it has happened. And what's really important here is the credibility of the victim. But credibility of the victim often comes back to these stereotypical views we have of who a real rape victim is and who is not, who is a less than ideal victim. We do want to, make sure that honest mistakes are not made, but I also want to point out to you that the false reporting rate for rape is actually just as low as it is for any other crime. So it's not a crime that has an unusual rate of false reports. In the past, we were always looking for corroborative evidence, but we often don't have that, and people often don't go to the police, and it often takes them a little bit of time to, maybe want to go to the police. So other things to keep in mind, though, is that the Sixth Amendment also provides someone with a vigorous defense, or the right to a vigorous defense. So some of the defense strategies that are used are that there's eyewitness error. They might attack the victim's credibility. And a lot of times what happens is someone will go into court and they'll say, yes, we had sex, right, which will account for the forensic evidence and the DNA evidence. But this is basically sour grapes. She consented. Other issues involve publicity in the media. We do have rape shield laws where people are not supposed to disclose the identity of a victim. And then we also have to look at issues of force and resistance. And this really depends on on state law, how much resistance and how much force is needed. So some states look at just the force needed to achieve penetration, and other states want to see more force than that. The reasonableness standard says the degree of resistance that expresses lack of consent can really depend on the circumstances, right? And, we also know that it can be really dangerous sometimes to fight back, that sometimes can result in to physically fight back, that could sometimes result in getting hurt. So people often talk about a dual verbal response, calling out for help while simultaneously pleading with or threatening the attacker. Corroboration is not required unless the victim is a minor, they were previously intimate with the offender, they did not promptly report the crime, or they provide a version of events that is inherently improbable and self-contradictory. As I mentioned, forensic evidence, a rape kit can corroborate a woman's claim, but many of them are never analyzed. They're often low priority. In Massachusetts, we do a unique thing. So a person who's been a victim of a sexual assault has 120 hours to go to the hospital to get a rape kit done, although obviously the sooner the better. And the kit is never tested unless the person decides to report to the police. So they're given a kit number, and if they decide to report to the police, then the police can identify the evidence with the kit number. If they never report to the police, the kit's never analyzed. In most states, though, there's a tremendous backlog here. And when they do look at these kits, they'll often find that they have several kits with the same DNA profile. So someone has done this multiple times. Over 60% of rapes are not reported to the police. They are more likely to be reported if a weapon is used or there's an injury. And again, that speaks to a victim's belief that somehow they'll be seen as a more credible victim. About 35% of all rape cases were cleared by an arrest in 2011, but cases are often closed and charges dropped in nearly 15% of cases. Victims often don't want to cooperate. They don't want to go to court. And about 25% of cases, prosecutors decline to press charges. And so a lot of those cases are falsely reported as exceptional clearances, even though they do not actually meet the requirement to be cleared that way. Oftentimes a plea is negotiated because it spares the accuser having to recount the crime, but it often means too then that somebody is convicted of a lesser crime, and it might not even be a sexual offense. As I mentioned, there are rape crisis centers. Boston has the second oldest rape crisis center. They're beat only by, I think, like a week or a day by Washington, D.C. Boston has one that has a 24-hour hotline. It helps connect victims with advocates. It's a place to call if you're really struggling. As I mentioned, medical advocacy allows a victim to be accompanied to the hospital. Generally, that's not by the police and the prosecutor. That's by a rape crisis advocate. Most rape crisis centers offer counseling. It's usually free of charge, and those are people who are specializing in those particular issues. Rape crisis centers work with other people in the community to really train them. So they'll work with police departments to train them about best practices, doctors and nurses. They often engage in a lot of educational campaigns as well. We also hear a lot of talk about, date rape drugs. It's important to remember that alcohol is actually the most commonly used date rape drug. So perpetrators will purposely get somebody intoxicated to lower their resistance. But during the 90s, we heard a lot more about date rape drugs. So Rohypnol, GHB. Sometimes one of the things that happens with both Rohypnol and GHB is they cause temporary anterograde amnesia. So not only does it lower your ability to resist an attack, but it also will erase part of your memory. People sometimes use Special K as well. Maximalists will define a date rape drug as any substance that renders the user incapable of saying no. So do also experts in the field. The Drug-Induced Rape Prevention Act of 1996 also imposed stiff penalties for sale or possession of these. And there's a lot of educational programs for awareness around this as well. There are even coasters that you can buy if you're having a party, or if, bars can use that you could drop a bit of your alcohol in it. Usually has like 5 testing strips on the side of it, and it will tell you if anybody's put something in your drug. In your drugs, sorry. In your drink. So we're looking at these two positions. Of course, we've got some people saying it's at an epidemic. It's occurring constantly. We do know that it's the least reported of all crimes. We also know that there's a lot of confusion around what, lesser crimes than rape. So other sexual assaults that don't involve penetration. Minimalists question this. There was a study in Great Britain that reflected most date rapes were about binge drinking alone, that women are playing the victim to avoid responsibility. But even minimalists agree that men should not take advantage of women when under the influence, and vice versa, by the way, because men can be sexually assaulted as well. In 1992, Congress passed the Federal Campus Sexual Assault Victims Bill of Rights, which imposed procedures outlining how colleges have to handle rape complaints. Colleges are sort of notorious for not handling this well at all. Anti-rape activists took a maximalist stance based on their belief that they had uncovered statistical evidence that it was a widespread but underreported problem. So they said that the term date rape really framed the issue too narrowly because assailants were often classmates, friends, and other acquaintances. So we often hear the term then acquaintance rape as opposed to date rape. Nobody really uses the term date rape anymore. The statistic here is 1 in 4 college women will be sexually assaulted. So a 1987 study looked at 3,000 female students at 32 colleges, and we could see some statistics here. I think some things to point out is that less than 5% reported to the police, 84% knew the victim, 50% told no one. No one. So that means not just the police, they told nobody. The minimalist perspective here says that the maximalist definition is too broad, vague, and inclusive, that some disturbing and confusing sexual experiences might fall into a gray area and should therefore be called quote-unquote gray rapes, and that by overestimating the date rape problem, they're manufacturing a crisis to further their social agenda. There's a lot of really great studies, in particular, about campus sexual assault, where the studies are really well designed. It uses legal definitions. It asks behaviorally specific questions. And they are all pretty consistent that 1 in 4 college women will be sexually assaulted. So what are some ways of preventing this? Well, we need to really educate people better. Most education around this revolves, as I mentioned earlier, telling women how to make themselves safer. We need to see more workshops about this. We just need to, we have a long way to go in this as a society. If you've watched the coverage of Dr. Nasser from USA Gymnastics, there's over 100 women that testified in one of his trials, and he had 2 other trials as well, one for child pornography and another one for some other sexual assault cases. And, you can see that these women didn't feel safe coming forward, and some of them did come forward to USA Gymnastics and reported it, and USA Gymnastics covered it up. So this can be a difficult thing to prevent when the people who are responsible for helping you are not responsive. So in 2011, this Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education issued some guidelines that colleges should adopt a zero tolerance stance. In 2013, they passed the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act. So this requires now, in Clery statistics, you also have to report dating violence and stalking. And in 2014, the Obama administration created a task force to identify best practices. We see a lot of this with Title IX, which is really kind of getting rolled back now. So just as we have a rediscovery of this, we have rediscoveries of groups within this, right? So men that are sexually assaulted. The NCVS reported about 15,000 males over the age of 11 were sexual assault victims in 2010. There were 9% of reported rapes in one study were male-on-male assaults. Men who are raped are highly unlikely to report it, so these numbers are grossly underestimated. If you think it's difficult for women to come forward and report, imagine what it might be like for a male victim. Wives raped by husband. A wife does have a right to say no. Forcible rape of a spouse. The first law against this was passed in South Dakota in 1975. By 1990, every state provided no immunity if the husband filed for divorce or separated. Again, there's a lack of reporting around this. PREA is passed in 2003. This is the Prison Rape Elimination Act. I don't know why it says Prison Rape Reduction Act. It's not what it's actually called. It's the Prison Rape Elimination Act. All sex in prison is considered non-consensual, so inmates are not able to consent legally. And this requires prisons to detect, prevent, and punish rape behind bars. It's an estimated 4.5% of inmates are victims annually, with women twice as likely to be assaulted as males. Male inmates are more likely to be abused or assaulted within the first 24 hours, of them being admitted to the institution. So what can we do? We can blame the victim. We don't really do this today. We can blame the offender. Sure, predators are responsible for their behavior. And again, we can come to that institution blaming approach. And we definitely have a problem culturally here. The root problems of forced sex would focus upon economic, political, social inequalities. We need to work not just with the criminal justice system, but within families, the economy, the military, religion, the media. And that wraps up our chapter on victims of rape and other sexual